Welcome to our /prorevenge. We have 2 stories today. I hope you enjoy. Story 1. Micromanager forced to step down after mismanaging a new retail service. This one might be petty, and definitely not as epic as some of the posts I've seen here, and I'm long-winded. Relevant background info first. Anyway, several years ago, I was working at one of the big hardware stores in my area. It's a household name and had some upward mobility, with decent pay for the area. I never really found a niche there after my first year and a half. I learned quickly though, so they kinda made me a Swiss Army employee. I could work hardware, plumbing, mix paint, make keys, prepare contracts for installs, and knew all the features and flaws of the appliance models we sold. I was happy to do this, because I was building a reputation as someone who could do everything. 2 years in, a new program was implemented that I was uniquely qualified to assist with. They created a new position for me. It was marketed as an all-in-one renovation/remodel service for interiors. I was to assist the designer with product selection, product information, contracts, and local marketing for this service. Everyone involved was super excited about it. Note: I was still only making $10 an hour in 2015 for this. The problem was that because this was brand new, no one knew how it should work. The designer basically had to figure it out for herself, while I tried to catch her up with all of the store and product knowledge I had accumulated during my unique experience with the company. Issues with the program. 1. It was way too expensive. 2. Product to be used had to come from one of our stores, which was limiting. 3. No one knew about it. It was a rocky start. Coworkers would call me over to talk to customers if they mentioned working on a big project, but that's all we had. No completed jobs to reference, or anything provided by corporate to get us running. We made our own stuff. I put together a video advertising the service, and got the nod from management to use a company card to purchase a TV and media player to roll the video on repeat. We built vignettes in the store to showcase our design ability. I had been picking up a lot from the designer, so it ended up being a partnership in effect. The micromanager. Enter Devin, the assistant manager. He had actually been involved in the project from the beginning, and had been pretty supportive, and brought good energy at first. But I think he got fed up with issues that we couldn't control: sloppy contractors refusing to fix things that they messed up, slow design process, as customers worked out what they wanted, and people just backing out after taking a bunch of our time when they see the price. We were, on average, charging $3,000 more for a small bathroom remodel on labor alone. Consulting and design fees were also worked into the final cost. The product was discounted to basically being tax-free, but as I mentioned, options were limited to products the company sold. It was just too expensive to make many sales on the poorer side of town, where almost everyone knows some kind of contractor or tradesman with connections. It wasn't a good market for this program, but we did manage to start hitting and exceeding our numbers. Number 7 in the region for the brand new program was not bad. And just when we finally started getting some business and a rhythm around 8 months in, Devin decided that it was not working fast enough for him. Obviously, the designer was to blame since he had no authority over the contractors or setting prices. She didn't know what she was doing, and he was going to make some changes. He honestly didn't do much besides hover, bring bad energy, and make terrible suggestions. He didn't understand the scope of what we had to do to get a customer out the door and happy. He forced us to cut corners and get the sale as quickly as possible, without concern for liability, for basically destroying a room in someone's home to remake it, or what was realistic in terms of timelines. Customers felt rushed and got nervous. They backed out. We came to a standstill. We would only have 2 or 3 designs in progress at a time, but suddenly, after working our asses off building the program, we had no customers for the first time in 6 months. Obviously, Devin was not subjecting us to his authority hard enough. So he went harder and fired the designer. I lost my patience. Justice, or injustice, I don't know. I'm a chill dude, but I had been working my ass off for this company, making peanuts on the promise that I was working towards something. I endured working for the incompetent managers that got their positions because they started working there at 18 and made it their life. The toxic alpha male, I will lead, you will follow BS was too much. So, I started bullying him back, making fun of him in a teasing way, where he couldn't really react without looking bad or losing control. I did that for a while, and he left me alone to run the program in the interim, since I was the only option. The designer and I had become friends though, so I was still mad about how it went down. I wasn't finished yet, but I didn't know what to do. Eventually they got another designer, and Devin had me moved back to what I had been doing before. Passed over for several promotions that I was more than qualified for. The market had been flooded with long-time employees that were being moved around. Bad luck, but I was done with the place. One day, we were sent an email link to an anonymous manager review survey. The store computers were set up with an always-on and logged-in user profile, so I wrote down the link and verified with a coworker that they weren't unique. In every department I visited that day, I wrote a review for Devin. All different ratings, some good, some bad, but I made the good ones so that they sounded bad, but as if I didn't know it was bad. I did that maybe 10 times. It wasn't character assassination or anything, just opinion-based stuff, with some vague examples, so no one could figure out it was me. I didn't lie either. I just said what people don't usually say out loud. He would barely look at anyone after that. A couple of weeks later, he resigned his position as assistant manager and took an exterior design position at the other end of the store, as far away from the departments he had been over before. Basically, the same thing as what we had done with interiors, but he was in the designer's shoes. I left a couple of months later to work tech support for DHS, but while I was still in training for that, my friends from the store told me he had gotten fired. Maybe he learned something? He should at least have learned how my designer friend felt. They were both fired at Christmas. That's the end of our first story. Now, let's move to our second story. Story 2. The time I ruined my high school teacher's career and got her fired in the greatest way possible. This story is widely known amongst my family, and is constantly brought up and joked upon in my group of friends, even years later. A buddy of mine suggested that this is the perfect place to make it public, so let's get into the shitstorm. Backstory. I was a senior in high school at the time, and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student, and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important, because to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade, and was widely known for being a petty heartless bitch, who the administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject, so naturally I had issues understanding the lessons, and would ask questions frequently. To some, these questions are easily answered, but to me it was rocket science. Usually when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me, in front of everyone, by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again, wow, surprised you don't understand it again, really, we have to go extra slow for you today, don't we," etc. I tried going to the administration about it before, but again, she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class. She would act respectful and normal for one day, and go back to being a bitch the next. This goes on for about half the year, until I had enough. I went to the local radio's hack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate, to make up for the lost time. Go ahead, feed the fire. Fast forward to the end of the year, and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class, when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote, because it's burned into my brain, was, "For been teaching here for over 10 years, and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office, to dismiss myself from school. We were allowed to dismiss ourselves if we were 18. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day, to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal, and we listened to a couple of the insults, before he stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present, as well as Mrs. Frank's. He told me, we would meet the next day where I could show him, and the rest of the administrators, the full tape. I walk into school the next morning, being the most nervous I've ever been for anything. I was called down to the office, where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Franks. What follows was some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators go from fed up with being in another useless meeting, to furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Frank go from confident and stuck up, to her realizing that she had fucked up beyond repair. She was publicly roasting herself, in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment, and the principal turns to me and says, "I think we have heard everything we need to, thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back, and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes, as I gave the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week, and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school, and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired, and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of her connections she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially, because no school district in the area would hire this walking piece of garbage. If you're reading this, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you, to go F yourself. Edit 1. Should have cleared this up in the story, however I didn't want to go into too much detail about the process. Yes, this was perfectly legal to do, and my parents and I did our research, to make sure we weren't breaking any kind of law. In my state, you can record someone in their place of business without both parties' consent. Edit 2. Wow, thank you for the gold, kind strangers. I believe this post became popular because almost everyone can relate to having a horrible teacher at one point in their life. I'm glad I could give some satisfaction to some of you who have had similar situations. Thank you for all the great feedback. Edit 3. I want to address some frequently asked questions. I regret sharing the dumbed-down version, because I left out the amount of crap I put my parents through during all of this. Tons of meetings and phone calls that would have made the story a lot longer, and I didn't think anyone would enjoy reading it. 1. I do not still have the tapes. It was in the administration's best interest to keep them, in case she sued for false termination, and it would have gotten out of hand if the tapes spread, and gave a bad reputation towards the district. Even if I kept the tapes, this all took place over 15 years ago, and there's no way in hell I would be able to find them. 2. Yes, I took algebra as a senior, because again, I wasn't the greatest student to walk those halls, and throughout all my years of school, I had tutoring. I'm sorry, I'm not a genius. 3. I don't remember what question I asked that pushed me over the limit that day. Thank you for all of the feedback, and I love reading each and everyone's stories that have had similar teachers, and revenge. End of story 2. If you want more pro-revenge stories, then check out the playlist in description. Have a great day.